Right now, someone less skilled than you is moving ahead. Why? Because they don't hesitate. They speak with certainty. They act like they belong. Meanwhile, you think too much. You wait too long. And in that waiting, you lose what could have been yours. The world doesn't reward the most deserving, it responds to those who believe they already are. The real enemy isn't outside. It's the tamed version of you, the one trained to obey, to shrink, to be liked. But there's another self, older, raw, unshaken. And it only awakens when you stop asking for permission to exist. Psychology calls it self-reconstruction. Spirituality calls it awakening. Stoicism calls it inner control. Neuroscience calls it neural reprogramming. But they're all speaking the same truth: you don't need to be taught. You need to remember. And once that memory returns, everything shifts. Your voice deepens. Your gaze sharpens. The world responds. Not because you force it, but because your presence now says what the old you could never scream. True masters never introduce themselves. They enter, and the atmosphere shifts. In feudal Japan, samurai cultivated Fudoshin, the unmoving mind. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh didn't raise his voice, his mere presence realigned the room. In tribal lands, the leader didn't announce his role. He was felt. These men didn't just possess technique. They carried a field. A frequency that said, "I know who I am, even in silence." And that knowing was so strong, others sensed it without understanding. Modern science now calls this coherence frequency. But the ancients already knew, posture speaks louder than words. This presence doesn't come from force. It comes from the absence of inner noise. They weren't trying to prove, they were simply being. That's raw spirituality. Living psychology. Invisible strategy. And if you learn to cultivate that silence, the world will begin to calibrate to your vibration. You want power? Then stop moving for approval. Stop reacting to praise like a well-trained dog. Stop bowing to the fear of rejection. Those who don't bend, become legends. Because true mastery begins when nothing outside controls what's inside. Psychology calls it equanimity. Spiritual teachers called it ego liberation. The Stoics? Emotional invincibility. Today, neuroscience and heart coherence studies confirm. Your body emits authority before your mouth ever speaks. It's not what you say. It's what you radiate. When you walk with firmness, breathe with clarity, and act without rush, something shifts in the air. People align. Not because you demand it, but because you are it. And that state of internal certainty is the kind of power no one can take from you. You were conditioned to seek acceptance. Since childhood, you were trained to ask for permission, to please, to fit in. But the ancients knew, the chosen one is the one who chooses himself. Not because the world said yes, but because he stopped asking. Rejection was never failure, it was the push to remember your worth. When you disappear, the world thinks it lost you. But in truth, you found yourself. In silence, you gather your pieces. In absence, you redraw your form. And when you return, you don't ask for space. You reshape the room. Science calls it emotional self-regulation. Jung called it individuation. Ancient sages saw it as the rebirth of the spirit. Absence stops being abandonment, it becomes sacred strategy. Because now, your presence doesn't seek approval. It commands. The tone of your voice reveals your position in the unseen. Those who speak low, with pauses and a firm finish, aren't requesting. They're declaring. They don't speak to convince, they speak as if they've already decided. And that vibration triggers something strange, people adjust. Without knowing why. Modern studies explain how the voice impacts the listener's limbic system. But the ancients didn't need labs to know. Authority begins in the energetic field. When you stop trying to prove, the world starts asking. That's silent power, invisible, yet undeniable. You don't need to raise your voice. You need to vibrate in alignment. Your energy is your identity before your words. That's why some people enter, and the room bends. It's not magic. It's coherence between presence, intention, and silence. And once you master that, words become optional. You weren't rejected. You were called to become emotionally unreachable. That pain? It was a spiritual surgery, cutting out your addiction to being seen. What used to break you, now builds you. Because when the applause stops, you learn to walk without crutches. And then you realize, your strength was never missing, it was just buried under the need to please. Buddha called it liberation from desire. Jung called it individuation, the birth of the true self after the death of the false one. The Stoics saw it as inner freedom, when nothing external can shake your core. Modern neuroscience names it affective autonomy. The ability to stay whole even when rejected. And the result? A man who no longer needs external validation. Starts radiating a presence no one can define. He doesn't chase. He doesn't explain. He simply exists, with such clarity, the entire room recalibrates. That's when silent power becomes feared. You don't explain yourself. You don't chase. You exist with such clarity, that others adjust to your presence. And they wonder, what is it about this man? But they can't define it. Because true power isn't seen, it's felt. And for that reason, it's respected. And sometimes, feared. This kind of presence isn't built through words, but through emotional stability and vibrational coherence. Psychology calls it self-reference, an inner compass untouched by external noise. The Stoics called it ataraxia, the unshakable peace of someone who no longer depends on the outside. Modern science studies this as coherence between body, mind, and the electromagnetic field. But the ancient sages already knew where all this pointed, the presence of the divine spark, alive, awake, and aware of itself. You don't need to speak loudly. You only need to stand in your axis with such presence that the room recognizes it before you say a word. That's when influence becomes effortless. Not through pressure, but through state of being. Rejection is not defeat. It's a filter. A redirection. When the world closes a door, it's not casting you out, it's testing how you choose to return. Some beg. Others explode. But the initiated one goes silent. He disappears. Rebuilds. Reconnects with what the world tried to erase. And then, he returns. Not to ask for space, but to become the very ground others walk on. The ancient masters called this symbolic rebirth. Jung described it as individuation, when pain exiles the false self. The Stoics saw it as internal preparation. Every no from the world becomes a deeper yes to yourself. Neuroscience now validates this as emotional neuroplasticity. The ability to rewrite your inner response instead of reacting on autopilot. When used with awareness, absence becomes strategy. When understood, rejection becomes refinement. You stop imploding under dismissal. And start evolving in silence. Until the world realizes, you were never the rejected, you were the test. You can master the room, the status, even the story they tell about you. But if you don't master your own mind, you're still a prisoner disguised as a king. The real war was never against others, it was always against the impulses that hijack you. Anger, neediness, anxiety, they're invisible thieves that slip in when the soul is distracted. And only an awakened man sees that emotion is either a weapon, or a weakness. You decide. Buddha taught, observe the thought, don't become it. Jesus, when faced with violence, responded with silence, absolute command over the impulse. Epictetus said, "No one can harm you, unless you allow it within." Modern neuroscience confirms it. Your emotional response shapes your biochemistry, your voice, your presence. Emotional control is not denial, it is inner alchemy. When your mind is no longer a public space, you become sacred ground. And anyone who steps into your field realizes, this isn't just another man. This is a fortress where peace isn't passive. It's intentional and unshakable. You were not rejected. You self-selected for something greater. The pain you felt was just the discomfort of outgrowing an outdated identity. While others chase acceptance, you understood, what didn't fit you, awakened you. And suddenly, everything shifts, you stop seeking explanations and start seeking meaning. Now, every scar becomes a symbol. Every silence, a message. Depth psychology teaches that real transformation begins with reinterpretation. The Stoics called it control of the inner narrative. It's not about what the world says, it's about what you choose to do with it. Spiritually, it's the desert crossing, where the old self dies so the new one can rise. And science calls it neuroplasticity, forging new neural paths, and a new life path. To rewrite your story doesn't mean to erase the past. It means recognizing it was only the prologue, not your final chapter. You don't need to explain yourself. You only need to remember who you're becoming. And those who remember, change the route. You killed the doubt, not with arguments, but with presence. While the world screamed for answers, you chose the silence that builds. You stopped explaining, and began to embody truth, living it without the need to defend it. Every step you take now doesn't come from fear, it comes from awareness. And the world notices. Because energy doesn't lie. This is what psychology calls congruence, when thought, feeling, and action align. The ancients called it soul reintegration. Warriors called it honor. Science defines it as neurocardiac coherence, when your heart and brain resonate as one. But the real effect is invisible. You become someone who doesn't need to be remembered, because you're never forgotten. Identity isn't a costume you invent. It's an essence you recover. And when that essence awakens, you no longer have to prove who you are. You simply walk like someone who's returned from a place few have the courage to go. Legends don't explain themselves. They're felt, even in their absence. What makes a man unforgettable isn't what he shouts. It's what he silences, so powerfully that it echoes in others' souls. True presence doesn't compete with noise. It lingers. Quiet. Untouched. Haunting. This is where spirituality merges with archetype. The man who becomes a symbol, a living myth, a mirror of what others fear, yet long to become. Psychologically, he embodies the integrated self, the totality beyond fragmentation. The Stoics called it aretê, excellence of being, without theatrical effort. Modern science now studies the neurobiological impact of individuals whose energy alters the perception field of entire groups. You don't speak to be understood. You speak as someone who knows that to disagree would be foolish. Because your posture, your calm, your grounded presence, already said it all before your voice did. And deep down, they all know. The man who cannot be moved, becomes a legend that cannot be erased. If you made it this far, understand, this was never about inspiration. It was about deprogramming. Every word was a precise cut into the domesticated version of who you thought you were. You weren't motivated. You were emptied, so you could be reborn as a silent weapon. Because real awakening doesn't comfort you. It reshapes you. This is not self-help. This is sacred ground, where identity becomes armor. Where spirituality isn't comfort, it's a blade. Where psychology meets soul. And science meets purpose. You're not here by chance. You were summoned. So don't follow just to follow. Like the video, if something inside you woke up. Subscribe, if you're ready to become a presence that doesn't explain, but transforms everything around it. The rest of the world is still asleep. But you, now carry an invisible weapon. And it's called awareness.